little bit about where you were born and where you grew up?
So I was born in Brooklyn, New York, to immigrant parents. My mom's from Costa Rica, from the Caribbean coast of Puerto Limon, from Jamaica, with ancestors from Jamaica. And my dad is a Panamanian, also immigrant to New York, joined the army and came to New York to join the rest of his Panamanian family, and also grandparents from Jamaica.
Hmm. And so, when did everybody move to Brooklyn?
Hmm. So my dad joined the army, and I think he was in Texas for a while, and then we have a family home on Lafayette Avenue in Bed-Stuy, and on my father's side. So my aunt originally was gifted the home by a relative, and that's essentially where our Panamanian family started to migrate towards. So my dad, and eventually he married my mom, and we were raised there. And then my uncle started there as well from Panama, my grandparents. And so I grew up in a family home with all my Panamanian cousins, my grandparents, uncles, and then everybody eventually moved out into their own homes, but everybody stayed in Brooklyn. Well, I went to a Catholic all girls high school in Brooklyn. And what's interesting is that my best friend was an Afro-Latina. And in many ways, we navigated the world of Brooklyn, of being in a school that was predominantly white and also being academic high achievers, right? And so, in many ways, we had to, outside of the classroom, explore the world, the diverse world of Brooklyn, whether that meant we were going to get food from the Dominicans or we were going to listen to music, just spend time talking to each other, really thinking about our identities, sometimes speaking in Spanish, but also really understanding that as Afro descendants, our heritage was also deeply rooted in Caribbean understandings. And so for me, even though I'm fourth generation Costa Rican, in many ways I also really deeply embrace the Jamaican heritage that has informed my entire line in my mother's side.
Could you speak a little bit about how Jamaicans got to Costa Rica?
Yes. So, very interestingly, last December, they in Puerto Limon, which is the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica, it was the anniversary of the first ship that arrived in Puerto Limon in 1872 called the Lizzie, and it brought over 103 Jamaicans. 100 of them were men, and three of them were women who came through the call of the Northern Railroad Company, right? Which essentially was a U.S. based, New York based, actually, if we can get a little further, Brooklyn based, uh, railroad company under Minor Cooper Keith, who was a white American who had been contracted by the Costa Rican government to essentially construct a railroad from the Central Valley to the Caribbean coast, which was the port that faced the Atlantic world. And because they needed to export coffee, which was their main crop at that time. And so Minor Cooper Keith, who was obviously an English speaker, went to the Caribbean and to former British colonies like Jamaica and Bahamas that they were English speakers. They were Anglicans, Church of England. They were not Catholic. Um, and basically hired people to come to work in Costa Rica, and it was supposed to be for a limited time. But what ends up happening is Minor Cooper Keith creates, has these laborers, these Jamaicans for the most part, construct this railroad, but he runs out of money to pay them. And so what does he do? He gives them portions of land alongside the railroad track, which becomes essentially used for bananas. And so Minor Cooper Keith then incorporates with several other companies to form what we now know as the United Fruit Company. And that is essentially where Costa Rica was one of the major producers in the world of bananas, probably mid 20th century. And the United States was one of the primary um, consumers of those bananas. And so the Jamaicans came over not only to work on the railroad, but then eventually work on the bananas. But also, many of them, cousins, right, sisters, brothers, went to work on the Panama Canal. And so that's why Panama and Costa Rica, particularly along the Caribbean coast, are so deeply tied. So it's not an anomaly that my father's a Panamanian and my mother's a Costa Rican, because there was so much movement along that coast as people went to work. The understanding, though, at least for the first generation, was that they were going to make their money and go back home to Jamaica and, build a home, school, whatever. Because these are not people who were enslaved, these are people who were educated. Um, and essentially, what happens is, because they do not go back to Jamaica and begin creating lives on the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica, my mother's a product of that. Um, they end up creating a whole enclave that is very much an Afro descendant enclave even today in Costa Rica. It was actually quite simple. I knew um, that I wanted to go to a school where I could continue to study literature. I love literature. And as a child of immigrants who were very cautious around the Brooklyn that I was born and raised in, so do or die, Bed-Stuy, right? And think about that in the 70s and 80s. My lifelong passion was the library. And so I very much had a deep affinity for reading and writing. And I wanted to be in a small school, and I wanted to be far enough away from my family that I had a sense of independence, but I could readily get back to them should I need to. Um, and the only other criteria that I needed was that there was no math requirement, because after AP math or calculus or whatever I did in high school, I promised myself that I would never have to do math again. And Vassar fulfilled all of that criteria. Actually, I applied early decision for Vassar, and it's really interesting because the guidance counselor at my Catholic all girls school had each of us, sit with her and give her a list of our prospective colleges. And I remember, and I was probably one of three Black women in my graduating class at this high school. She looked at me with all earnestness and sincerity and said, "You're not Vassar material. You're never going to make it. You will not survive there." And I was at the top of my class, right? So I was probably in the top three. But she looked at me, I mean, as if she said it with deep caring, that I would not make it at Vassar. And so I applied, and early decision. And one of the things they had us do was, and I remember it was January and students hadn't come back to campus yet. They asked me to come and do an interview. My mom went with me. I remember walking across campus, and there was so much snow. I did the interview, and the gentleman came out and sat down with my mom, and there was a reception area. And he said, "Okay, we don't normally do this, but I'm just going to let you know that we are offering Natasha a place. I'm offering it to her on the spot, and she will get a letter." Because that's what happened in those days, right? You actually got a letter in the mail that you were accepted. Um, and I proved my guidance counselor completely wrong. And I withdrew all my other applications once Vassar sent me that letter, at the end of the week that I was accepted. And that's why I chose to go to Vassar. I wish that I had taken more Africana studies classes. And I say this because my very, very best friend was in Africana studies, and I was the only Black woman in the English department. There was one other Black male, in my 4 years at Vassar who was in the English department. And so I was doing Sir Gawain and the Night, I was doing Shakespeare, and really what I wanted to do was Caribbean women's writing. I want, Anglophone Caribbean women's writing, which I eventually did, but it was a struggle. And so I remember taking my first class in Africana Studies with Lawrence Mamiya, who recently passed away, and it was on the Black church. And it just opened something for me. And I mean, I'm feeling chills right now because it was such a powerful class for me. And in many ways, it sparked a knowing or familiarity that was inside of me, or curiosity that I think eventually, as I get to, my junior year abroad and then my further career, it really opened up a, a process inside of me of affirmation. And so I think classes in Africana Studies, but even if I could take another class again with Mr. Mamiya, may he rest well, that would be my choice. Let me tell you how I got to Kenya to begin with. So my best friend and I, uh, as I said, she was in Africana Studies. We had decided we were going to go junior year abroad, and I was going to England. I already had the idea that I was going to either Cambridge or Oxford, and I was going to be there. She was going to the Sorbonne in Paris, and then we were going to spend the summer after that spring semester of our junior year in Paris. And the plan had been long established. And I will never forget, I lived in Cushing and she lived in Noise. And I walked across the campus to the study abroad office, and I went to begin the application process to go to England. And I will never forget where they said, well, you need like, I don't know, a 93.4 GPA in your English classes in order to qualify to go to England. And I had like a 93.2. And it was literally a matter of a decimal. I mean, it was minuscule. And they were like, no, you can't apply to England. You don't qualify, so you cannot go. And I remember, and it was raining, and I walked all the way across the quad, and I was weeping and weeping. And I went to Noise, and I banged on my friend's door, and she was like, "What's going on?" And I remember her boyfriend was there, and he was a senior at Vassar, and she had on her wall a world map. And so he pulls off the world map off her wall and he puts it flat on her bed. And he says, "Why are you crying? Just choose someplace else." It had never occurred to me. I was so devastated that one, the plan was changing, but two, I couldn't go to England. And that's what I wanted, right? And so literally, I closed my eyes, I turned around 3 times, and I put my hand on the map, and it landed on Kenya. And that is what happened. Wiped my tears. I walked right back across the quad, went back to the study abroad office, and I was like, well, how about, can I go to Kenya? And they were like, yeah, you only need like a 75 to go to Kenya. The criteria was totally different. And I was like, okay, sign me up. I had never thought about Africa before. My sensibility and understanding in terms of my own heritage was very much Caribbean and Costa Rican based. So the idea of being in Africa, my parents are like, "Where are you going?" And it's like, "I'm going to Kenya," Um, and it was the best gift of my life. It opened up my entire identity. I remember the first night that we landed in Kenya. We were taken for an orientation, and I was with SIT, so the School for International Training. So there were students from all multiple universities. There were a couple of Vassar people who I'm still really good friends with now, and we all went to this a safari place, right? So it was incredibly dark outside. And I remember they said, "Oh, you're sleeping in these houses, but the bathroom's outside." And so I'll never forget ever the moment of leaving and going outside and looking up at the stars I had never seen such beauty in my life. I mean, I wept. I literally wept and I was like, oh, Africa, oh, Kenya, I understand now. It was an incredible welcome. I felt at home. And that's what happened to me. We were all staying with homestay families for like 2 weeks. And then what ended up happening was I decided I didn't want to stay. I didn't want to leave my homestay family. And so I just stayed with them and commuted every day to classes. Everybody else stayed at like a YMCA. I stayed with my homestay family. I came back to Vassar, and in my senior year, I applied for a Fulbright. I got it to go back to Kenya, and I stayed with my Kenyan family for another year because of that moment. My Vassar education, one, taught me how to write and read in very particular ways. It also allowed me the opportunity of getting a Fulbright and going to Kenya. But I think Vassar really enhanced my love of reading and writing in ways that were really critical. It also, I do need to say this, it also taught me what I don't want to read anymore and what I do want to read, my preference, right? So I feel I am very well read in sort of Western classic or global North classical literature in some ways. And in some ways, I feel like that has filled the pot of the requirement of the things that I need to read and gain expertise in. And so I'm devoting the rest of my life to reading all the other things that should be within certain canons but have been historically left out.